being turned into something else.
Yeah,
Is the
maybe
fabric
applique
worn in
over
the middle of
chair.
a square or
Some
the
of it
seams?
is, some of it is, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have the rest of the Hebrew Bible to get through today. All right, so finishing up Proverbs, here's the basic structure of it. So these are based off the headings that are found in the book itself. We have the Proverbs of Solomon, King David's son from Israel, the Proverbs of Solomon. Turn your ear and hear the words of the wise. These are also the sayings of the wise. These are the words of the Proverbs of Solomon. These are the words of Agur, Jakeh's son from Massa. And these are the words of King Lemuel of Massa, which his mother taught him. Now, we don't really know anything about these last two folks or about their land of origin, with one exception. And that is that Massa is identified in Genesis 25 as a descendant of Ishmael, who lived in northern Arabia. And so there seems to be a stereotype of these sort of very wise people of the East, which we also get later with the story of the Magi, but it's the idea that people from cultures to the east of them were very wise. And also, as an interesting segue, Job was from that region. So that is the end of Proverbs. That's all we missed last week. Yeah?
Yeah, when I did read a little bit about Proverbs, and it said something about Solomon, David, and Israel have numbers, and they all add up to the same number, or it is the same number. So I don't know where I read that, but
Could be. Numerology
Yeah.
has been important at different times in those
I was
cultures.
going, oh, hey, we just talked about that.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
A lot of you.
So my other favorite Bible, or favorite book in the Hebrew Bible, is Job. And if you're interested, again, I brought more books on these. I have a Liberation Theologian's take on Job, Gustavo Gutierrez, Bill McKibben, who's an environmentalist, his take on Job. Thank you. William Safire, who's a conservative political person who actually wrote a commentary on Job. And then an old Bible commentary on Job from Marvin Pope, who's done a lot of work on that. So if you're interested, I'll put these here to look at later. So Job is a very interesting text, right? And what do we usually think about when we think about Job?
His
Poor
toils
Job.
and his misery.
Yeah,
Right.
poor Job. And then
Yeah.
you think, poor family.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
a little bit.
Job is a book that can be very challenging for us. And it was also a book that was very challenging, we believe, for its first audience as well. It's a book that has been always challenging to people because it brings up the problem of theodicy. And the problem of theodicy essentially is that if God is all good and God is all powerful, why does evil exist in the world? Right? How do you square that? How do you square those pegs? And that has been a perennial question in Christian theology for as long as there's been Christian theology and well beyond. It was a major question of Jewish theology that comes up here. We have no idea about the authorship of this book. Tradition ascribed it to Moses, but tradition ascribed a lot of the books to Moses that we don't believe was authored in that way. There's also no clear sense of dating. As you'll see in a little bit, there's a lot of antecedents in literature all around there that are very, very old. But there are some scholars who argue that it must have been kind of in the 6th century or even a little bit earlier, as the problems of theodicy can be understood as being similar to the problems faced by the people in the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. So there's an argument to be made that this might have been written around the time of Jeremiah and Lamentations, but we don't know, and there's no evidence for it other than just the themes of bad things happening. Some scholars, and I tend to follow this line of thought, argue that this, as we've seen before, had been added to for reasons that it was generally considered unpopular, right? Because if you think about the middle part of Job, where there's the conversations with the friends, like the bad things happen, and then there's these back and forths with the friends, and then there's this conversation with God, that's not necessarily very, very satisfying. And so there's an argument, and this was the argument that I learned from Ted Hebert, who's a scholar who taught Job at McCormick, that the prologue and the epilogue were added to sort of not only frame this because they're prose, we know they're very different from the poetry of the conversations, but the reasons for that may well have been, hang on kiddo, just a second, to explain what is happening and to sort of try to make it better, right? Like, why did God do these terrible things to Job? Oh, because Satan was going around and sort of goaded him into it. And then these bad things still happened, and that response of God's is not very great. Oh, well Job gets magically material blessed in the end, so it's fine, right? So kind of like what we see with Matthew when you have later communities coming along and saying, this text doesn't really work for us. There was probably an addition at both the beginning and the end to sort of make it more palatable, in a way. Do you need something? No? Okay, let me do. Yes, dear?
No, there's something else. I put one of the Bible stars that has the enemy of God.
Okay. Well, there's no enemy of God in here, but that's actually a really good segue. So, we'll get to that in just a little bit, though, okay? All right. So, we start with, this is the basic structure of Job. You have this prologue that was added later, it's prose, and it helps to frame the poetic dialogues. Now, some scholars argue it was not added later. I personally tend to think it was, based off of having only spent a semester with it, so admittedly, my opinion doesn't entirely matter, but that's kind of how I fall on the thing. Then you have these three friends.
Yeah.
Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And you have these stages in basically the majority of the book, almost 30 chapters of dialogue between Job and his friends. And there's a typical pattern that starts out with that, where Job speaks, then Eliphaz speaks, then Job responds, and Bildad speaks, then Job responds, and then Zophar speaks. And then we get to this fourth stage where there's this new friend who appears, who seems to be younger, kind of tries to have a better argument, but doesn't really. And then that happens, and then we get to God's response. And then there's the epilogue, which, just like the prologue, is prose, everything's fine, happily ever after the end. They just kind of gets...
Didn't the
tacked
friends,
on.
weren't they kind of not really friends in the fact that they said, well, what did you do that was so bad, Job?
So here's what's fascinating about the friends. It's in this book that we see both the best example of how to do pastoral care and how to sit with someone in the middle of trauma, and the worst. And they both come from the friends. Because does anyone remember what the friends start to do when this thing first happens to Job?
Weren't they supportive at first?
They go to him and they sit with him. They don't say anything, they're just present. They're there. Being present is one of the first things they teach you when you're taking in class on pastoral care. You sit with somebody in the midst of their trauma. You're with them. You don't try to make it better. You don't say anything, because there's nothing you can do to make it better, and there's nothing you can say in those moments. And then they do the absolute worst thing you can do, which is they try to figure out what happened. And I want to say they just went with what their culture assumed, but I think a lot of people still think this. What did you do to deserve this?
Yeah.
Right? And so a lot of this becomes a refuting of that. Very similar to how Jesus sort of refutes that when somebody asks, why was this person blind? Whose sin was this? And Jesus is like, no, that's not how that works. But those threads point out how common that theology was in the ancient world, and is in many cases still today. Hey, you may sit around. Come here. Okay. So, and we have some parallels, and this is interesting because the parallels to this book that we find in ancient Southwestern Asian and African literature are very old, right? There's the Sumerian text from the 2nd millennium BCE, Man and His God. There's a Babylonian poem from around the same time called I Will Praise the Lord of Wisdom. Then we have something actually from the Egyptian Book of the Dead called the Protestation of Guiltlessness, which sounds very similar. And then from a little bit later, we have the Babylonian Theodicy of 1000 BCE. So we do have parallels to this type of literature that occur throughout the text. And then we have a very interesting character, Ha-Satan, or the Satan, right? And we Christians seem to like to know what to do with it. Excuse me, kiddo, I can't see my notes when you're right there. The Ha-Satan just means the accuser. This is a character or characters or a moniker for a divine figure that occurs only 4 times in the Hebrew Bible. And each time, Ha-Satan is described as being a member of the divine council, right? So when you hear the sort of the divine we that comes out of God, or it seems like God speaking to angels or something up there, Hasatan is considered part of that. Hasatan is very explicitly not responsible for the suffering of God. God is the one who causes the suffering to happen according to the story. And the role that the accuser has is like that of an adversary who's meant to test one's loyalty. There's a connection to sort of a role that happened within the royal courts. I want to say Babylon, but don't quote me on that. It might have been Persia. Their role is basically going around to test people. Are you loyal to the king? Right? That was their job. So this is kind of like a royal enforcer. It's not until much later that we start seeing Satan in the way that we understand it, and that gets, this sort of accuser gets conflicted. Wow. Elsa had a Band-Aid, and I now have it. Elsa apparently had an owie. Let me put that in there. I mean, because frankly, the devil, as most Christians understand it now in the West, has as much to do with Dante and Looney Tunes as it does the Bible, because of those cultural influences. But the character Hasatan is very different than how Christians today tend to think about Satan, which is fascinating, I think. And then, because I'm apparently very egocentric, I'm going to write sort of the conclusion to my Job paper when I was in seminary that I think sort of sums up my thoughts on Job anyway. Whether Job truly was innocent or not is inconsequential when the ultimate questions of who God is and what God does in the universe are pondered. Job was concerned merely with his own suffering and demanded answers from a perspective that he was somehow greater because of his self-described innocence. God is concerned with all life, and God's justice is not based on Job's notions of right and wrong. To wrestle in such a manner with the divine must truly be a gift, even one that could only be described as awesome and terrifying. So those are my very brief thoughts on Job, because we have the rest of this Hebrew Bible to get through today. Hey, what's up? Do you kids want to go play?
I really want to.
Okay, because I'm in the middle of teaching right now. Okay, you can preach a little later, kiddo. Let me get through this. Give me another half hour. Okay, Song of Songs. So definitely kid appropriate material now we're moving into. Okay, excuse me. What? I don't know, but I'm sure she'll be here to play with you all in a little bit. Okay, so it's also known as the Song of Songs, which is essentially means the best of all songs. In this text, we find these poetic speeches by two young lovers and occasionally by her friends and brothers. The genre of this is actually kind of unclear. Many interpreters since antiquity have seen this as a dramatic dialogue between two characters with occasional choral interludes, but it's not very well developed. The closest regional parallel we have are love poems from Egypt that are, again, date to the 2nd millennium BCE, which is interesting. We see a lot of these very old influences on the biblical texts, just like we saw with Job. There's a really interesting question. You might have noticed that some of the metaphors that we find in this one, if you remember this book, are very explicit and also relate to animals. So there's a question of why is it that animals are found attractive? A friend of mine from my PhD program wrote a very interesting paper on that. His name is Gerald Beverly, and caused a lot of eyebrow raising at the Society of Biblical Literature, who normally don't like to think about the sexualization of animals in ancient literature, but it's there and there are parallels to that. So that's apparently a difference in cultures that we find gazelle attractive if we lived 1,500 years ago, or no, sorry, 2,500 years ago in a very different space. Anyway, that's in there. Oftentimes this has been interpreted allegorically, both within the Jewish and Christian traditions, because it's very inappropriate for children in its imagery, right? And so it's been interpreted as God's love for Israel or God's love from the church, depending on the perspective of the interpreter, because it's really, really scandalous. Like if you read it at face value, these kids aren't married. They're clearly talking about some very explicit late night texting type stuff. It's a secular love song, right? And so the question for many people of faith has been, why is this in the Bible? How do we, because God, there's no reference of God whatsoever in it. That's what I'm doing right now. Hang on. In the late 1st century, there was a Rabbi Akiba who argued that this was sung in taverns. So even 2,000 years ago, this is a rather raunchy bar song. And yes, I see. And oh my. Okay, don't do that. It actually reminds me a little bit of the story of Romeo and Juliet, like that type of romance, because there's some stuff that the brothers don't seem super happy about the relationship that their sister's in. So that's sort of interesting. But that is the Song of Songs. Moving on, we have the Book of Ruth. We have no idea when Ruth was written. Depending on who you ask, the range is from either the 10th to the 4th century BCE that's been argued for. So it's either a very, very old book or a very, very young book in terms of the Hebrew Bible. Jewish tradition ascribes this book to being written by Samuel, but it's pretty clear that it would have been written long after the time that it narrates. And its purpose is really unclear. We don't know why Ruth was written. It starts as being an explanation for David's mixed ancestry, maybe, right? Because if you remember from some of these other things we've seen, there's this big prohibition against marrying outside of your culture. Yeah. In about a half hour. Do you want to go play until then? That might be more fun for you. I mean, I think lecturing is fun, but okay, that's my job today. You can wait till afterwards. Okay, well, why don't you go get it? Why don't you go look at it? Why don't you go with your sister and go look at a Christmas book? And then you can come and teach when I'm done. How about that? All right. So it could be a corrective to this Deuteronomic law that said that no Moab shall be admitted into the assembly of the Lord, because David has Moabite ancestry, and that becomes a problem. And so it's possible that that's what this book was doing. It's a very lovely book. Goethe, the German guy, called it, quote, the most charming little hole of antiquity. So Goethe loved it. So, you know, the Germans are really into the Bible at this time, so that's entirely possible. In the story, you have these two women. Of course, you know, we've heard it preached on recently, Ruth and Naomi, and their story does give us some insight into how ancient Israelite society worked and what the roles of women were and what they were able to have. Right? Remember, she has to be pretty cunning in order to basically get by after the loss of male family members. Thinking about gleaning, that kind of the shrewdness in trying to sort of pivot into a relationship in order to find that Goel, that redeemer, to protect them. But it's clearly patriarchal, right? This culture is entirely dependent upon women having male relatives. When both these women are left as childless widows, they take the initiative to get a distant relative, Boaz, to marry Ruth. And that marriage does produce children who then restore these women in the eyes of the community and also from an economic perspective. As I mentioned, Boaz was their Goel, which is Hebrew for redeemer. The redeemer was the kinsman who had the responsibility to assume the role of male protector when the head of the household died. And that was very important because outside of that familial relationship, there was no social safety net or protections whatsoever. So outside of that, you would probably starve unless you found food some way. Which is also why consistently we see the importance of caring for widows and orphans, because widows and orphans and also immigrants who do not have a family structure are people who exist outside of that social protection that happens within the family. That's why there's this consistent push to protect those who are outside of that. Sound good? Alrighty. Lamentations. Sorry, your finger hurts. I'm sure it'll be just fine. It's probably not going to fall off right here. I'm a bad parent. I'm sorry. You're fine, Cal. It's going to be fine. We'll get you a Band-Aid later if you need one, okay? Speaking of lamentations, so these were collection of sustained and detailed reactions to the fall of Jerusalem in 586. Lamentations after the fall. Possibly like Job, but we don't know. But this is very much sort of a kind of take on the trauma that happened in that experience. The post-biblical tradition ascribes it to Jeremiah. There are several attributes that are similar to that. Most critical scholars don't come to that conclusion. Then the assumption that a lot of critical scholars now have that this was written not long after the fall, though. This is probably still in the midst of that trauma. It's written in a very similar fashion to funeral dirges of the time. Like, for instance, David's lament after Saul and Jonathan die in 2 Samuel. And also in quite old 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE Sumerian literature. on funerals and dirges and things like that. So again, has this tie to this much older body of literature. What do you need? You want to go get your book? Okay. So, it's similar to Sumerian Laments and Lamentations. There's also some similar theological dimensions in those texts, the destruction of the city being attributed to the actions of an angered local deity. So that kind of trope we see throughout that period.
Still has something to say.
Okay, well, hang on. Audrey, I'm trying to teach right now. I'm sorry, kiddo. I got a lot of material to get through. And lectures are boring, so you should get used to that because this will not be the last one you hear from me or any other teacher. So in Lamentations, what happens to Jerusalem is understood as being the punishment of God, and it's described quite vividly. It wrestles with a drama that we often see in various cultures in ancient Southwest Asian tropes. When a nation is defeated, that meant in those cultures that God was less powerful than the God of the nation that won, but that presents a problem because how can the God of Israel, the God of everything, be less powerful than the God of these Babylonians who come in? And so the end of Lamentations really tries to wrestle with that theological issue. And the poet's faith in God's supremacy gets expressed along the lines of, with a loss of explanation for how this can be reconciled. And I suspect that's why a lot of people understood this as being God's direct punishment. Because typically, you know, if the Babylonians conquered you, it was understood because their God was more powerful than your God, and your God can protect you. And what is one logical reason why that might happen? Well, maybe we've done something to anger our God, so our God was like, this is on you. You're on your own. Good luck. And that's kind of what we see throughout some of the prophets, too. That's sort of the attitude. It's a very flippant, hot take on that attitude, but that's
It's an easy
kind
out,
of what
too.
they're
Tell
doing.
you something. Elsa doesn't work.
Okay. Well, that's probably for the best. We don't need Elsa singing right now, as much as we would all love to hear it. Okay. And now for another fun one. Ecclesiastes. Did I miss it? Oh, yep. This one. Okay. This is the everything is pointless. And when I say that, that is literally verse 2 of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes. Everything is pointless. It's a very controversial example of wisdom literature. It was questioned by rabbinic authorities as to whether or not it should have anything to do with the canon because it has some very unorthodox views.
What's Elsa's boo-boo?
Yeah, we'll have to get a Band-Aid for her too. Band-Aids all around. It says that it's the Ruminations of Solomon, but it's pretty clear that he didn't write it, and much of its views of life and divine justice disagree with a lot of the biblical tradition, which is interesting. It's actually quite a subversive text. So let's read some of it, shall we? Starting in... So starting in chapter 9. So I considered all of this carefully, examining all of it. The righteous and the wise and their deeds are in God's hand, along with both love and hate. People don't know anything that's ahead of them. Everything is the same for everyone. The same fate awaits the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the pure and the impure, those who sacrifice and those who don't sacrifice. The good person is like the wrongdoer. The same holds for those who make solemn pledges and those who are afraid to swear. This is the sad thing about all that happens under the sun. The same fate awaits everyone. Moreover, the human heart is full of evil. People's minds are full of madness while they are alive, and afterward they die. However, whoever is among the living can be certain about this. A living dog is definitely better off than a dead lion, because the living ones know they will die, but the dead know nothing at all. There is no more reward for them. Even their memory is lost. Their love and their hate, as well as their zeal, are already gone. They will never again have a stake in all that happens under the sun. Go, eat your food joyfully and drink your wine happily, because God has already accepted what you do. Let your garments always be white. Don't run short of oil for your head. Enjoy life with your dearly loved spouse, all the days of your pointless life that God gives you under the sun. All the days of your pointless life, because that's your part to play in this life, in the hard work under the sun. Whatever you are capable of doing, do with all your might, because there's no work, thought, knowledge, or wisdom in the grave, which is where you are headed. So that is a fun, inspiring message that I'm really wondering why it's not in the lectionary. It's fascinating that the only time I've ever read this liturgically has been at a funeral, because that's the only time this ever comes up. But I've never read that text in a Bible, in a class or anywhere else in church before. Hi.
John, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
What's the definition of Ecclesiastes?
So Ecclesiastes comes from a Hebrew word which I cannot pronounce, but it's Koheleth, which means the preacher or the assembler, which I don't remember how that's related, but I it might be that's the Hebrew word, and I think Ecclesiastes might be related to that, but I don't know off the top of my head.
I don't know how to use ecclesiastical in a sentence.
Like the contemporary word ecclesiastical?
Yeah.
It basically means, well, we use it to mean like church. Like an ecclesiastical body would be a church or like church leadership. Yeah. it
And
could be used outside of
Ecclesiastes is the noun form for assembly of people
that. So that would make sense.
under God, I guess.
Okay.
While you're here, let me tell you just how pointless all life is.
Yeah. So did you all notice anything? It's very uplifting spiritual text.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here. Can you go on your own, or do you need help? Do you remember where it is in my office? Okay. I need to take a 3-minute break. Excuse me. Come on, kiddo. So talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic. It's Ecclesiastes. Good luck. It's easier to walk when you can see where you're going, Gary.
I think she was peeking at you.
Oh, okay, good.
Linda and I took a course many years ago on Job,
Yes,
and
poor Job,
poor Job.
poor family.
All I remember about it was that the first session, the minister who was leading the course said something about it being written by man. Do you remember what the comment was? Anyway, the fellow who was in the class with us said, "You're saying that this isn't the words of God?" And the minister said, "No, this is, a story that was written." And he said, "That's it. Got up, left the church." Because he was it's the term fundamentalist.
Yeah.
That this is very important, and this is God's word.
And it's blasphemy to say otherwise.
Yeah.
Otherwise. I didn't realize that under the sun, the race doesn't always go to the swift. I didn't know that came from here. It's sort of a euphemism
When I'm done, you can
that
start.
people use. The race doesn't always go to the swift,
Yeah, you can
nor
see.
the battle to the mighty, nor the food to the
Well,
wise.
learn from how I do it, and you go.
Well,
Okay.
I don't have to worry, I'm none of those.
So this is probably a really good example of why a lot of us in our tradition and in critical biblical scholarship do not make the argument that the Bible speaks with one voice. Because if it does, I'm not sure what happened here.
Schizophrenic break from reality.
So in terms of getting back into the text itself, we don't have any specific details that help us on the date. The oldest manuscript that's been found was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was dated to the mid-2nd century BCE, so the book is probably older than that, obviously. But it's not earlier than the 5th century because it uses several Persian loanwords that they would not have had access to until those cultures interacted. In terms of its structure, it's actually similar to how we might read something about Socrates, in that it describes a first-person quest for the meaning of life. It's contains a collection of thoughts, but it's without a discernible order. The organization seems to be about as random as my desk is. You peek in to see about what that looks like these days. I should probably do something about that. And it's puzzling. It contains a number of seeming contradictions. At times, the author states a position that's even at odds with the dominant position throughout the book itself. So it doesn't even agree internally, which is fascinating. And there are questions for that. Was this a later editor coming back and trying to correct some things that seemed off? Was this the author later in life changing their mind and adding that to that? We don't know. Were these inconsistencies deliberate, right? Because one argument for why it's like the way it is that it reflects on how life is kind of like that, right? Because life isn't always orderly. Life doesn't always make sense, and life isn't always, right? So when we're talking about the meaning of life, it makes sense that maybe there would be a book that is kind of like how we experience life, in which case this is brilliant and wonderful. But in terms of interpretation, it's often called things like skeptical, nihilistic, existentialist, pessimistic, realist. What we do know about whoever wrote this is they were not an atheist, because God exists, but humans cannot even begin to fathom divine purpose. It actually has its closest parallels to a Babylonian proverb. Yes? You have my attention. What do you need? What? Okay, just thought of it. Hang on. We'll get through this together, I promise. Okay. It's concerned with the universal aspects of human existence within the context where God exists. And it ends with a rather cautionary epilogue that we presume was added by a later pious scribe. Did I add that on here? Yes. There's no end to the excessive production of scrolls. Studying too much wearies the body. So this is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Worship God and keep God's commandments, because this is what everyone must do. God will definitely bring every deed to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or bad. So it kind of feels like, after a while, some people just kind of gave up and tacked that on the end, almost as like the FBI warning at the beginning of something. This book is fascinating, and I wish we could spend a lot more time with it, but there's a lot going on there. Speaking of fascinating books that have a lot going on, Esther. This is a story of palace intrigue, if you're into that sort of thing. It's set early in the 5th century during the reign of Xerxes, who was the ruler of Persia between 486 and 465. Probably written about a century later, perhaps. Yeah? I know. I'm sorry I'm boring. You can go play in the other room. That'd probably be a lot more interesting. No? All right. The details about how the Persian court operated were accurate, but there's no independent evidence supporting the existence of any of the other characters in the story. And it makes a pretty big chronological error. Exiles weren't actually deported until 597, which would make Malachi over 100 years old during the events of the story, but we've seen that sort of thing before. It's probably a historical novella that was written as an etiology or an explanation for why Purim exists as a festival, as far as anyone can tell. It's also a very secular story, which is interesting. It refers to neither the tradition or the Torah of their people. It doesn't talk about Jerusalem. Being Jewish is seen as an ethnic identity. There's no sense of piety found within the story. And Esther is either fully assimilated into Gentile culture, seems to be fully assimilated into the Gentile culture. She doesn't keep kosher laws. She does not hold to the dietary restrictions that she should have as a Jewish person at that time. And the argument that this is for... There's an argument to be made that this is actually a story meant for holiday entertainment rather than what Scripture usually does, which is give a narrative explanation. But it does give one for Purim, which is interesting. I'm a little busy right now. You want to go play in the other room? You might be happier. You can stay here, though, if you want. Just, try not to lecture over me, please. I'll be done soonish. Before worship, okay? I promise I'll be done before worship. Probably. So that's interesting, right? That we have several, that it's almost as if Scripture is more interested in the life of this community than it is sort of coming up with. What am I trying? I'm going off book here because I'm a little distracted. It's fascinating that it kind of documents this wider range of life of the people in the community than perhaps we might give Scripture credit for. But yeah,
I wonder,
story.
That gentleman that was so fundamentalist that everything in the Bible is the Word of how he would feel about some of these secular stories getting in there. That just,
Who knows?
Who knows?
One wonders. Daniel. This is a book that is short yet significant and very strange. Written in the mid-2nd century BCE, we actually can date this within a 3-year period of 167 and 164, unlike the last few texts that we've seen, because of the specific prophecies in there. And this is a period of oppression by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who died during this time, and so this seems to have been a hope for deliverance after his oppression. So a very specific ruler who'd been oppressing the people. It looks back to to a much earlier setting that we've seen prophecies do. Probably again to sort of say, oh, I'm not talking about this king that just died. I'm talking about what happened a long time before. I'm talking about the king that just died. I think it's kind of one of those things. There's a lot of apocalyptic literature that ends up in here. There's this kind of fantasy that God's going to pull back the fabric of reality to show that God will triumph over evil in the face of what we have here. And this is, I think, one of the earliest, or one of the fascinating parts about Daniel, the earliest known manuscript of Daniel, again found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, can be dated to 115 BCE, which means this text would have only been in circulation and have been written for about 50 years, based off when scholars are pretty certain it was written, which means it got popular and was already in circulation to a variety of communities around the diaspora in just a 50-year period, which is kind of amazing and probably meant that it was really, really popular. Okay, well, we'll put it back on a little bit. You don't need your shoe to sit here. Some of the court tales that we find in Daniel, perhaps chapters 4 through 6, are probably from late Babylonian and the early Persian period that would have been brought together. So probably some earlier material that was brought together. Ellen, I'm sorry you're having a problem with your shoe. It's dense, it's hard to read, and it's confusing. It reminds me a little bit of Russian literature in that several characters have multiple names throughout it. Right, the characters' names seem to change throughout the text. You know, it's interesting. And when we ask what Daniel's trying to do, it's possible that this could be doing something very similar to Esther, in that it's asking a question, do we incorporate ourselves into the empire so we can thrive, which seems to be what Esther was doing, or do we remain insular and keep ourselves separated from the empire? So that's kind of a big question that's important to Daniel, and it's not entirely consistent. If you all are interested, I typed out my sources for what I've been using, if you want those throughout this class. Those are right there. Thanks for joining me. This will be up on YouTube when I get around to it. We won't go much longer. So its perspective is not entirely consistent. The structure is also interesting because it's written in 2 languages. The first part was written in Hebrew. Hang on, no, it's fine. We're going to be done just a little bit. Hang on. I'm trying to get through this. So from 1:1 to 2:4a, it's written in Hebrew. Then 2:4b to 7:28 is written in Aramaic, and then it goes back to Hebrew. So, and that's odd. That break also doesn't. It's not logical with the story itself, right? It's not like this chapter was written in Hebrew, and then these chapters were written in Aramaic, and then back to Hebrew. It just kind of breaks. It doesn't align with the main division of the books, and so scholars throughout history have wondered what is going on there. The scholar Carol Newsom argues that the original core was probably 4 through 6, written in Aramaic, and then later added to, which is why the Aramaic goes into verse 7. And then an introduction is later added on in Hebrew, and then an apocalyptic vision in chapter 7 that's distinct from others was added probably during the Hellenistic period, and then 8 and 12 are added kind of at the end of that. So she argues that it's basically compiled over time in different languages. Chapters 1 through 6 are court stories. They're heroic fiction that star Daniel. And then 7 through 12 are apocalyptic visions, right? They talk a lot about end time stuff. But even this division doesn't really align with how scholars think the Bible came together, which is strange. But Daniel is, as I mentioned, weird. Even its composition and how it's structured is weird. Not just the,
Is that structure in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
So we only have a fragment, so we don't know.
Okay.
That's a really good question. I don't know how far into things we have to go until we get a complete copy of it. I'm sorry. Here, why don't you just hang out for a little bit, and then your tummy will feel better. And speaking of our tummies, Ezra and Nehemiah. So again, as we've seen before, we know them as separate books as Ezra and Nehemiah, but originally and in the Hebrew Bible, they're one unit. And most contemporary scholars think that they were originally one thing. They're a composite work that comes from a variety of sources. And again, parts of these are written in Aramaic and parts of these are written in Hebrew, which is also, again, interesting. So Ezra 4:6 through 6:18 and 7:12 through 7:26 are written in Aramaic. There's a frequent shift in perspective, so it frequently shifts between sort of a third-person narrative to what is supposed to be an autobiographical account. It's probably fictional, but it's possible that it was based off the actual writings of the historical figures Ezra and Nehemiah. It covers a huge period from the second half of the 6th century into the 5th century. There's some chronological problems that happen in the dating of missions and relationships. Okay, so Ezra and Nehemiah were people who lived in the 5th century. Ezra was a member of the priestly family and was a scribe of the Torah. Travels to Jerusalem with the sanction of the Persian king to try to encourage leaders from Israel to impose the commandments, especially those on marriage to foreign women, right? So he's a priest who's very interested in this don't marry foreigners. That's kind of his thing. Nehemiah happens around the same time as Ezra's moved to revival. Nehemiah was the governor of Judah, who was also appointed by the Persian king. So this is unlike Esther, which is sort of almost an anti-imperialistic perspective. This is a very pro-imperial perspective, because while Ezra and Nehemiah are both Jewish, they're both Jewish officials within kind of the Persian court who are there by the authority of the Persian king. Nehemiah served as governor. He was also apparently the Persian king's cupbearer, so he would have been someone who would have been very close to the court in Persia. Claims to have taken the initiative to ask the king for permission to rebuild Jerusalem. And what's interesting is there's immediate internal opposition for that rebuilding of Jerusalem, including by a woman prophet named Noadiah, over resentments about the imperial authority that were exercised by Ezra and Nehemiah. And also the neighboring countries oppose this happening because they're afraid that if this becomes another center of power, there will be more conflict. That gets us to the question of intermarriage. The community survived, of course, even after the trauma that followed the fall of Jerusalem. And so they're able to redefine themselves in this period as the exile is ending and rebuild the temple. Now, for some in this time, the only way to keep their identity was to insist on both religious and ethnic purity. So from that perspective, the marriage of outsiders was considered to weaken group identity and to contribute to cultural assimilation. And you have tensions between those who were exiled and those who stayed. Even the people who worshiped God, who were not exiled, were viewed as suspicious. Jeremiah even refers to the people who were exiled as being the good figs and those who were not exiled as bad figs. There was this idea that some who remained also viewed those who were in exile as those who were being punished by God, whereas they were not. So there's a lot of animosity already between people who had been neighbors and family who then get exiled.
Wow.
The standards that are now being imposed by both Ezra and Nehemiah are those being imposed with an imperial blessing, right? So not only did this exile happen,
What does exile mean?
So exile means you're forced to leave your home. You have to go somewhere else.
Oh.
So not only were they forced to be exiled by this previous empire, this new empire comes along and is now sort of forcing a way of doing faith on them from the perspective of the people opposing this. Because again, both Ezra and Nehemiah are imperial officials. Well, Ezra is doing what he's doing with imperial blessing. And so we see the perspective in this book of leaders who had been part of diaspora who then wanted to impose their views back on those in Judah to kind of coalesce everyone back into one culture based off of how I think we should do it, kind of a thing. And this work presents one view that we see biblically on intermarriage at the time. But of course, both Ruth and Esther would disagree with that. So it's interesting that, again, we have these conflicts between these different theological takes that are happening within Scripture itself that we see in the writings. In terms of structure, you kind of see that there. It starts with a return from exile and early restoration, and then you get the mission of Ezra as sort of a first-person memoir, and then that shifts to Nehemiah, where it starts again with a memoir of Nehemiah, and then a list of returnees that's similar, identical to Ezra 2. Then you have the ceremonies of renewal and the Jerusalem census, and then you have a resumption of the Nehemiah memoir. And now we're to the end, finally. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And just like with Samuel and Kings and Ezra and Nehemiah, this was originally one book that later gets broken into 2. I'm almost done. Just give me like 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll be done. Okay? I know. This is a long morning. Everyone else is right there with you. Sorry. So the Hebrew title is a very generic term, and it translates to the book of the events of the days, Chronicles. There's no conclusive internal evidence for its dating, but it clearly is from the post-exilic period, and it ends with Cyrus's decree from 538, allowing the people to go home. I'll be right there. Hang on. I don't know when April's gonna. She loves hanging out with April, and is wondering where they are. Please don't put your feet on the table. I know this isn't a dinner table, but I put books on there. So most scholars tend to date it in either the late 5th or 4th centuries. The connection to Ezra and Nehemiah led many until fairly recently to conclude that they shared the same author, but most contemporary scholars don't think that. So for instance, while Ezra and Nehemiah are not fans of Samaria at all, which was where those who lived in the northern kingdom of Israel were before its destruction, Chronicles is actually more inclusive and thinks the ideal of Israel is not just Judah, sort of, Judah reborn, but all of the 12 tribes coming together to form one Israel. So even though they share similar perspectives, that idea of who Israel gets to be is much more inclusive in Chronicles than it was in Ezra and Nehemiah. The chronicler is seen as a revisionist historian, editing sources and adding to their own in order to support an ideological position that all of Israel was best led by pious rulers who remained faithful to the commandments and who united all 12 tribes at the temple. There are a variety of sources that we have for this that we know of. The primary source is the Deuteronomistic history, especially 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Ellen, I'm trying to teach right now. I'm almost done. Give me a couple minutes and then I can do it. I don't know. We'll go look for her as soon as I'm done, okay? Maybe she's here already. I don't know. Can you give me just a couple minutes? Thank you. So Chronicles is basically lifted in some cases verbatim for the story because plagiarism was understood a little differently in the ancient world than it is now. There's no citations either, I've looked. Basically, it wasn't a thing. However, where the Chronicle deviates from the original sources is where we think things are interesting, right? Like, why do you say this verbatim here and then kind of change things up there? What is the change in perspective? So those are some questions we might want to ask of a text like this. It also draws from other biblical sources. For instance, nope. Just did one slide for that one, sorry. So for instance, throughout the Pentateuch, probably, which at this point probably would have been in a final form close to what we would recognize today. There are some quotations of the Psalms. There's some quotations or allusions to the prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then the ending of 2nd Chronicles is actually the same as the beginning of Ezra, which is interesting. Then there's some other sources listed that we don't know of existing now. Names that are, some of them are not names, but things that are ascribed to the prophets, like a particular oracle of a prophet that we have not recovered or do not know of, which is sort of interesting that there are some lost sources that are brought up in Chronicles. And then just briefly in the structure, 1st Chronicles 1 through 9, almost. Hang on. I know, thank you for being patient. Lectures are hard to get through, I get it. Chapters, 1st Chronicles 1 through 9, it's a genealogy from Adam to the 5th century. Then you have the story of the death of Saul, the story of the reign of David, the story of moving into 2nd Chronicles, the reign of Solomon, the history of Judah from Rehoboam to the fall of Jerusalem, and then finally the decree of Cyrus allowing for the return of the exiles. And that is how the Hebrew Bible ends. And those are my sources. History, It's a study of the past.
Ooh.
Okay, so we made it. I had some additional challenges because I didn't think we had enough material to get through in time, so I wanted things to be a little bit even more interesting. But thank you. That's the Hebrew Bible. Questions, comments, and then just in mid-January we'll start up again with the New Testament.
Do you have all those?
Let's see here. Hang on.
Because they would be very heavy.
So
to
that
carry
and
around.
that are over there. These three are podcasts. That's from my notes from a class. That is online. That's actually a really great website if you're ever looking for early writings from Christianity or their dating. There's really good translations into English here at earlychristianwritings.com. Notes from class. Ted's Yahweh's Landscape, which is over there. This is online. A very new, the Electronic Babylonian Library. It's hard to navigate. It's mostly in German, but it has the most updated translations of early Babylonian literature. That's where, like, if you remember all the way back when we were talking about Genesis and I was quoting things, that's where those translations came from. Daniel Harrington's over there. Gottwald's over there. Coogan is the book I used a lot of. Brueggemann was over there, might be on my desk now. And then these three useful charts are YouTube videos.
That's a lot of heavy reading. Heavy reading. We opened up a commentary that's about yay thick.